Welcome to the WET Podcast, episode number 2. Thank you for tuning in to the WET Podcast. This is episode number 2. I am your host, Eric Marshall. You can find show notes at ericmarshall.net. That's www.ericmarshall.net/wet. ericmarshall.net/wet. You can find me at emarsh on Twitter. I talked to Paul Levinson today, and I was very happy to do so because he has such an interesting perspective and such a long history of academic writing, nonfiction writing, fiction writing, music, all kinds of things. True Renaissance man. He was very generous with his time. I was very happy to talk to him, and I think that you'll really enjoy listening to this. He has some great advice and an amazing perspective on the media landscape of today, kind of how we got here and where things are going. He has some great advice for writers and creators, and he really, it was really a pleasure talking to him. I was very thankful to get almost an hour of his time, and he was very gracious to do that, and just so excited. So that's awesome. I want to thank everybody for the positive feedback on episode number 1 with Audrey Waters. I want to remind you that you can find this podcast on iTunes and on Stitcher and anywhere else that you find podcasts. So go ahead and check that out. I do appreciate reviews on iTunes and the other platforms that you find podcasts on. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. I have with me Paul Levinson are you at Fordham University?
Yes, I am.
In New York. I'll just tell you just kind of quickly how I came across your work. I came across you when I started grad school in 1999. I quickly became interested in digital media and film studies, and particularly in how digital media changes film spectatorship and distribution. That's what my dissertation was about. And so I read your Digital McLuhan pretty early on in my grad career, and I ran across a lot of your articles just kind of over the years. It wasn't until recently that I didn't know that you wrote fiction until I came across you on K-boards, which for people who don't know is a message board for publishers and people who use Kindles and stuff like that. So I started researching you, and I was like, oh, this guy's actually really, really well-rounded, especially for somebody who also does academic work. So that's kind of my background with you, but mostly it comes from the academic, the Digital McLuhan and some of your other stuff. So I guess I thought maybe we could start there if you wanted to talk about kind of maybe some of your earlier nonfiction and academic work and kind of springboard from there.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say that I often say, only partially in jest, that critics of my scholarly work have said it reads like science fiction. And critics of my science fiction have said, what is this, an academic article? In fact, I have like a tiny short story called Synchronicity, and it's up on a place called Buzzy Mag. It's like 700 words. It's a short story, and I've gotten like some compliments along the lines of, I really loved your essay. So, you know, the serious part of that is actually I'm complimented, because I think that good nonfiction should have the elan and the just sort of literary thrill, if it's working, that fiction has. There's no reason that scholarly nonfiction has to be a boring tome. And at the same time, science fiction, I think at its best, is important in a philosophic or sociological or psychological sense. Certainly the Foundation trilogy is a major work of philosophy. it has to do with Laplace's demon. If you could know everything in the universe and therefore predict the future, well, what then? So to me, these two kinds of writing are very closely related. So maybe I'm not that well-rounded, although I'll certainly take the compliment. And I should also mention I also write and sing music. So another guiding principle of mine is, as far as we know, you only get one ride on the merry-go-round. You might as well do as much damage as possible. There's no point in holding back. I mean, and that's actually advice I give to everyone about everything. If you can do something, if you have an idea, go ahead and do it. Now, the fact that I started writing and getting nonfiction published prior to my science fiction is almost a coincidence. And in fact, it goes back, I can tell you the exact year in which that decision by me was made. And the year was 1978, early 1978, when I was writing two things. I was writing a science fiction novel, time travel novel, parts of which were later published as short stories in analog, by the way. And I was starting to work on my doctoral dissertation. And I had this idea that I could do both, based on what I just said. It wasn't all that much different. That, I do a little of the novel, go to the dissertation, do some of that, go back to the novel. So that worked for about 2 months. And I came to realize that, hey, I was getting much more work done on the novel than the dissertation, which, by the way, is called Human Replay, a theory of the evolution of media. And I'll talk to you about that in a couple of minutes or seconds. But anyway, I decided back in 1978 that I had no hope of ever completing the dissertation if I was writing science fiction alongside of it, because it was just too much fun writing the science fiction. I mean, you can't beat it. You make up your own rules. It has to have some semblance to reality, but you don't have to worry about footnotes and references and all those things. Anyway, my first then really important nonfiction work, in my opinion, is my doctoral dissertation, which way back in the 70s developed a theory which at first seemed so obvious to me that it didn't need any development or further explanation. But the more I thought about it, and the more I looked at what other people were writing, especially critics of technology and media, who are legion, I realized that I ought to develop this idea a little more. And the idea is simply this, that as we advance our technology, what the technologies do become increasingly human or human-like. They don't become more artificial, they become more human. So, back in the 70s, there was no such thing as a Google Hangout. There really wasn't even a personal computer back then. If we had wanted to do this back then, we could have done it through a telephone conversation. Or I guess I could have gone into a studio, and you could have gone into a studio. It would have been very expensive, and we could have done it that way. But the point is, what we're doing right now, looking at each other, and not only that, recording this so people will be viewing it, that couldn't be done in the 1970s. And it's a perfect example of the trajectory of technology, that as it develops, it fulfills our human inclinations, our human perceptual habits. And in the dissertation, I went into a whole analysis of how, well, first what the telegraph did, on the one hand, it fulfilled our need to communicate instantly across great distances. On the other hand, it was extremely artificial. The telegraph dealt in communication which was triply abstract, right? I mean, there's the Morse code, which has to be translated into written words, and those written words, in effect, are transcriptions of what would have been spoken. So you have 3 levels there before you even get any communication. So that was highly artificial, and it's therefore not at all surprising to me that we next developed a telephone, next developed audio-visual materials, and so on. So that dissertation was finished actually in late 1978, and in many ways it's the basis of all the other nonfiction books that I've done. Probably my next important nonfiction book in terms of making an impact on the world, and there were a few philosophy books that I wrote in between. But it really wasn't until 1997, just a few years before you read Digital McLuhan, that I wrote what in my head to some extent is a couple with Digital McLuhan. It's called The Soft Edge, A Natural History and Future of the Information Revolution. And what it does is it traces the history of communications from speech itself through the cutting-edge media of the late 1990s and shows how at every step of the way it made us more human, not less human. By the way, I came up when I was writing my dissertation back in the 70s with a name for this, a nice, awkward, ungainly name. So, you know, anthropotropic. Anthropo from the same root as anthropology, human-like. Tropic, you know, plants are heliotropic. They grow towards the sun. And so what I'm saying is as media develop, they become increasingly human. They literally evolve under human direction towards more consonance with human communication. And then, you know, a lot of what I did was basically keeping pace with what was going on. Digital McLuhan, though, was a book that I had in mind ever since I started working with Marshall McLuhan, which I had for a few years in the late 1970s. And a month or two after he died, I wrote to an editor at St. Martin's Press. This is one of the reasons, by the way, when I tell you what the response was, why I have, in many ways, so much criticism for the destructive impact of traditional publishing. Because I wrote to this editor and laid out essentially what Digital McLuhan was about. It wasn't called Digital McLuhan. It was a proposal in 1980, so I wasn't talking about digital media, but it basically was a book examining the applicability of McLuhan's ideas to the media, not only of the 50s and 60s and 70s, but even the beginning of the 80s. And I got what can only be described as a smarmy response from this editor, who was otherwise a nice guy. And it basically said, oh, you know, Paul, you know, you're such a good writer, but, you know, no one is interested in McLuhan anymore. You know, he's had his day, and, you know, do you have any other ideas? And that. So, you know, I said, okay, forget it. I put it aside. I got back to it in the late 1990s, and what I wanted to do is bring McLuhan's thinking into the modern digital age, because what I realized pretty early on is all of our digital media, in one way or another, fulfill views that McLuhan already had. It's not that he was prescient, but he was so keenly in touch with the way human beings communicated and thought that he understood that we would someday be able to communicate to anyone, anywhere in the world, with anything that we wanted to, and he called that the global village, which of course was not in existence in the 60s. And then, you know, we can talk more about this as well. New Media, my most recent book, first published in 2009, second edition in 2012, brings these ideas to bear, my ideas, McLuhan's ideas, on the revolution in social media. And I called the book New Media, not because I was stuttering, but because, you know, a new medium would be the traditional iTunes or Amazon, in which you as a consumer have enormous access. But as a producer, you have virtually no access, meaning you couldn't put a song up on iTunes. Even now, it's not easy to do that. And up until the Kindle, you couldn't put a book, if you had written a book, up on Amazon. One of the reasons I'm so excited about the Kindle revolution is because it has turned consumers into producers. And that, I think, is the key with all new media. So they're not just new, they're one level even newer than that.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. The whole the move towards consumers becoming producers, and there's a lot of resistance to that, right? In publishing right now, and in the music industry, there's a lot of pushback from the people who have the power now, or who have had the power, right? Because new
Yeah,
media was about selling stuff more efficiently, right? But yeah, with the
exactly
same
right.
models, but new media, it flips it on its head.
Absolutely right. And what has happened, and to some extent, it's always been the case, but the computer revolution disseminated digital technology so quickly that the powers that be in the traditional media were caught off guard in every single case, just about. So, we saw this first with music. Traditional record companies, I mean, they still exist in name, but they're no longer at the cutting edge of music presentation. And neither are radios for that matter. People stream the music on Spotify. They may listen to the radio, but it's not as it was when I was growing up in the late 50s, early 60s, when you would listen to the radio like your lifeline to the world for the next Beatles song, or whatever you were following. And there's no doubt that traditional publishing has really been caught off guard. And without giving away specific information, I spent weeks haggling with one of my publishers about what they thought were necessary permissions that I had to get to include in my book. Um, and there is something called fair use, which is ambiguous. What fair use is about is if you're using something for educational purposes and you have a small enough piece of the overall work, you don't need permission. But on the other hand, even a book that's used as a scholarly textbook, someone is making money from it, so you might need permission. But the publisher was so harried and so feeling that it was under the gun that I had a conversation which I wish I'd recorded. It's almost laughable. I have a quote from President Obama in the book. Now, in copyright law, it's crystal clear things that were never covered by copyright. Among them are official government statements. And they say to me, well, did you get Obama's permission? So I said, do you know, the copyright law? At one point, they asked me, did I get permission? I was quoting a conversation that I was having with a student. And two things about that. Number one, you don't need permission to quote your own material. And second of all, verbal utterances, if they're verbal and not recorded, are also not subject to copyright. So it's gotten so bad that publishers don't even understand, in some cases, their own areas of expertise because they're scrambling so quickly to, they think, catch up with. And in some ways, they're not wrong because the Kindle revolution is such a radically different development in well, since the printing press, the relationship that has existed between the author and the publisher, in which the author, the first printing presses were so expensive that only the monarchies could afford them. They weren't even private, they were public, and that's why the first political documents for most printing presses were what we would today call propaganda.
Right.
But as time went on, they became less expensive, so you did have private companies printing up documents, and that led to the rise of newspapers and, books as political tracts. But the author, in that case, was still out of luck. And, interestingly, the very word copyright comes from a royal dispensation. It was a right to have copies made of your work, which the monarchy gave to you, the author. So England actually was ahead of the game. They changed that with the Statute of Anne, I think in 1710 or something around then, which said, hey, copyright is something that the author has. But the commercial publisher has held sway over the author ever since then. And they don't like the Kindle revolution. And that's why you have disputes like Amazon versus Hachette, and this is being recorded before it's going to be viewed. So for all I know, that's going to be settled, but it certainly is not going to be forgotten from the history of media, whatever happens. And actually, I'm thrilled to be part of this. And every time I publish something on Kindle, in addition to just the satisfaction I have as an author having a book published, I just love doing it that way. It's a lot more fun than sending the manuscript into your editor, and if you're lucky, maybe a year and a half later, the book will be published.
Right, right. I think a lot of people don't publish because they send something in once or twice, it gets rejected, and they say, "Oh, I guess it wasn't good enough," and that's not the case at all. A lot of times, right? It's just that editor didn't want that at that time for whatever reason, didn't think it could sell or whatever. But with Amazon, you can create your own covers. You can edit. You can publish new volumes if you want. And it's up right away, right? If you finish your book today, you can have it up by tomorrow. Right.
Yeah, you could have it up by today if you have a cover and you're all ready to go. Yeah, I mean, I guess Amazon takes, like they say, it could take as many as 12 to 24 hours. Usually, it's published 4 or 5 hours after you click the publish button. But I've given this a lot of thought for decades, and it's interesting to think about the fact that up until the Kindle, as far as books were concerned, the gatekeeping model was basically the only game in town. And, its advantage, its raison d'etre, its publicly given reason for why this is so good is that it keeps garbage out of the public intellectual realm. So, this is what you send something to whether it's an article to a newspaper that you want to have published or a book to a publisher. There's someone there who reads it and can say, oh, no, this is no good, so it doesn't get published. So that's its advantage. But, years ago, back when I was a kid, I read a poem by Thomas Gray, Elegy in a Country Churchyard. Okay. And it has so the whole poem is worth reading. But there's a little bit of that poem that always stuck with me. Many a gem of pure serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bare. Many a flower was destined to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. And that, I think, those 4 lines capture the tragedy of the traditional gatekeeping publishing model. The tragedy of who knows how many great works were out there that dullard publishers turned down. And, this is not an abstract, arbitrary thing. The Beatles were turned down by 25 different record companies before, EMI signed them. Imagine that. Can you imagine that? These are the Beatles, the same music. I Want to Hold Your Hand, the great songs from back then. 25 tone-deaf, people in record companies said, no, maybe can you get a little more of a Four Seasons sound? It's a little too rough. And everywhere you go, you find that. Dune was turned down by as many publishers before it finally found a home. One of the best science fiction novels and giving rise to the trilogy and, in fact, a whole series in science fiction. In fact, I would say Dune is second only to the Foundation series. So this was turned down by numerous publishers. And that, I think, it's a tragedy for the author or the musician, but it's also a tragedy for the human species because we were deprived of all these works in which the author just didn't have the psychological wherewithal to send it out to a 26th publisher after 25 people had turned it down. And that's the error in the traditional gatekeeping system. That's the weakness in the system that Amazon corrects. And yeah, there's no such thing as just a medium that only does one thing and it's an advantage. There are always trade-offs. And yeah, so the fact is, I guess there is less quality control, to call it that, when people can publish on their own. But there was a study done, and I talk about this in New Media. It was published, I think, in Nature magazine back around 2005, 2006, and it was a study that very carefully examined the errors in the Encyclopedia Britannica and the error ratio on Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia, of course, again, is totally bottom up. There are no, everybody's an editor. There are no editors who have superior rights. There are administrators. There's a little bit of control, but basically you can write anything you want on Wikipedia. And this study in Nature found, no difference, no significant difference in the error levels of this established, austere Encyclopedia Britannica and in Wikipedia. And of course, the reason is that Wikipedia has its own error correction. Every other reader, when he or she reads something, can correct it. So I think this new system is great, and we're just at the beginning of it.
Yeah, I agree completely. I wonder how many great novels are in someone's drawer somewhere because they're rejected by editors, or and people who haven't found Amazon yet. And you think about if the Beatles didn't go to that 25th or 26th record company, and think of all the great bands that didn't. And you're right, they did form there was a function that the gatekeepers, and I use the past tense here, the gatekeepers did perform a valuable function, but good stuff got left out as well. And that's now it's completely different because they had to worry about costs, they had to worry about distributing the physical copies of the books or the records or whatever. And now if I put up, like, I'm writing a novel and a memoir right now. I'm not sending them to anybody. They're going straight up on Amazon when I'm done, once they're edited and the covers are done, and I can't wait. It's gonna be great. And if they don't sell, they don't sell. It costs you my time and the money for the editing and cover, but the risk is lower. I don't have to worry about gatekeepers telling me what I can and cannot do, and if anybody who wants to read it will be able to read it for a reasonable price, and it's nice.
Exactly. And one of the things I've discovered, especially at my age, and I always urge people along these lines, gets back to what I was saying before about doing it. If you have an idea, do it. Once you get something out to the public, once you, by whatever means, and as we've been discussing, it's never been easier with Amazon, using Amazon, but by whatever means, get your work out there to the public, it instantly begins to take on a life of its own. And what can happen is totally unpredictable. Way, way, way back in 1972, when I was a singer-songwriter, and I had songs out on Atlantic Records, Buddha Records, whatever. Well, my band and I recorded an album, and we brought it around to like a bunch of record companies, and there was some interest, and who knows, if had we been a little more patient, we might have gotten a deal with a record company, but patience was never one of my virtues. I don't even know if it is a virtue. But we decided to put it out on our own label. So I created my own record company, Happy Sad Records. Paid for getting it printed up. What I always tell people is it sold a negative number of copies. I think we got more copies returned than we sent out. Anyway, for many years, the only human beings who heard this album, Twice Upon a Rhyme, were my wife and our kids. And, they seemed to like it, although maybe they were just trying to make me feel good. But back in, now it seems like a long time ago, like maybe 2002, a record magazine in Japan is doing a review of what they call lost cult classics. And they have like a major review of my album. Now, it certainly was lost. Cult, maybe. Classic, not so much. But anyway, so as a result of that, I put it up on iTunes, and a company called Beatball Records in South Korea gave me a lot of money to reissue it in CD, and then another record company in England, Whiplash Records, said, can we remaster the vinyl and put it out? So my point is, these songs were recorded in the late 60s, very early 70s. But because I had enough wherewithal and motivation to put it out in a record form, 30 years later, it was rediscovered, and now I won't say I'm making as much money in my music as I am with my writing, but it is selling. It's amazing to me. So the moral there for everyone is, yeah, you have an idea for a book. First of all, write it, but second of all, just take that little bit extra effort, get it up there, get it out there on Amazon. And maybe it won't happen overnight. Maybe it'll never happen. Maybe 5, 10, 15 years from now, when you've almost forgotten about it, someone will read it and discuss it. Look, even the fact that you first got to know my work by reading Digital McLuhan in 1999, so here it is now 2014. Who would have predicted in 1999, certainly not you and not me, that we would be having this interview, 16, 15 years later. So all of that is testament to the life of its own quality that the publication in the larger sense, whether it's music or books or whatever, getting it out to the public has.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the way and the way I found you again was through a forum for people who are self-publishing, right? And I saw your name and I was like, is that the same Paul Levinson? And sure enough, right? I was like, oh. So it was one of those like kind of synapses started firing, and I was like, oh, okay. And it's great. I love this. You have this kind of I want to say just do it attitude, not to kind of take off of Nike or whatever, but you have this attitude of you want to do it, just do it, right?
Right.
And I think that for a long time I struggled with fear, right? Of especially as an academic, a budding academic, I was like, oh, I can't write creative work because I'm an academic. That won't be accepted, right? Well, all the while, the best science fiction I'm reading is basically media theory and cultural theory. I read K.W. Jeter's Noir. I don't know if you know that. It's and I'm like, this is as good as a lot of critical theory or media theory that I've seen, or David Foster Wallace, I think fits into that very well. A lot of fiction is so it took me a long time myself to figure out, well, you just you do it, you put it up, you put it out, and see what happens, right?
That's right.
And that's a great attitude. So you worked with Marshall McLuhan, and now if I read correctly, your dissertation advisor or mentor was Neil Postman.
Yeah, and I'll tell you the story of Neil. First of all, okay. I love him. He passed away a few years ago. I miss him. And in fact, he was my main teacher at New York University, where I got my PhD in a field of study that Neil was partially responsible, along with Marshall McLuhan, for creating, called media ecology. And it has nothing to do, with growing vegetables, although that's very good and important, but it's the ecology of media and the fact that the media are each interrelated with other media in the same way that biological species are in the natural world. But I have to tell you about Neil. When I first started studying with him, we thought somewhat alike about media and its impact on society. And then somehow Neil took a turn, and he began talking more and more about, oh my God, these media are damaging us, and they're rendering us illiterate, they're making us rude. He wasn't the only one who was saying it, but it was arguments along the lines of, if a kid grows up watching television, and when you're watching television, it's perfectly okay to turn around and talk to somebody else. It's okay to get up and walk out of the room. It's okay to fall asleep in front of it. Well, then this is teaching the kid that that's appropriate behavior to do in a classroom. So, it's an interesting analysis, but I think totally untrue. Mainly because human beings are very, very adept at getting the difference between different media and different in-person situations. When I was a kid growing up in the 1950s, there used to be like an old joke, if your little kid is watching Hopalong Cassidy, he was like a cowboy, make sure you don't have a toy, make sure the kid doesn't have his little toy cap pistol, because there was an urban legend, which was an urban legend. I mean, for all I know it happened, but the reports were urban legends, that a kid was watching Hopalong Cassidy and the bad guys got the drop on poor Hopalong, and so the kid said, "Here, let me help you," and threw his little cap gun through the television screen and destroyed what in those days, it probably cost like $1,000. It was worth like $10,000. But that never happened, and the idea that media can make us rude and media are hurting us, I think is just not the case. And in fact, back then, and this was an age before the internet, when television was at the cutting edge of our communication, I thought television did a lot of good. I mean, obviously, you could literally learn stuff on PBS, the original Cosmos series with Carl Sagan, which, by the way, was one of the inspirations for the sequel to The Plot to Save Socrates on Burning Alexandria, because that was the first time I really got to know Hypatia, this ancient woman who, well, I don't want to give too much away about her story, but she played a role in the declining years of the ancient library of Alexandria. So I thought the television was actually a very useful medium and had enormous benefits. I even wrote an article called The Benefits of Watching Television. But Neil and I, near the end of my time as a student and afterwards, although we remained close personal friends, we also were at extreme disagreement over the role of media. So much so that Neil thought that the digital revolution was bad. He thought it was dangerous. He thought it was just a greater waste of time. And I once even had a conversation with him where I said to him, and I'd actually studied this in one of Neil's classes, the Phaedrus, this Socratic dialogue in which Socrates is talking to Mr. Phaedrus, or whatever his first name was. They only had one name in those days for some reason. But Phaedrus says something, "Have you read the book? Have you read this guy's book on this topic?" And Socrates, rather than addressing the content, of the question, basically performs a media analysis, and he says to Phaedrus, "Hey, I wouldn't read too many books if I were you, because they're not a really very good way of communicating." Phaedrus says, "What do you mean?" Socrates says, "Well, if you have a book in front of you and you have a question and you ask the book a question, it gives you but one unvarying answer, namely what's already written in the book. So, books have their limitations." And Socrates, the great proponent of dialogue, is saying it's much better to keep this open and in a dialogue form where you can have a real conversation. So I remember I had a conversation with Postman in the 90s, and I said to him, don't you see that the internet, even in those days, is basically giving to the written word what Socrates was yearning for back when the Phaedrus was written. In fact, in that dialogue, Socrates says, "I yearn for an intelligent writing which will answer questions that are put to it." And, now, for example, on Kindle boards, that's most of what happens there, and it's great. Somebody has a question. What do you think of this cover? What do you think of Kindle Unlimited? What do you think of this or that? And, there can be hundreds of responses. This is the intelligent writing that Socrates yearned for. And by the way, I talk a lot about that in The Soft Edge, Natural History and Future of the Information Revolution. But I often say, although Postman was my most important teacher, and that's true. I mean, being in his classroom was a real thrill, that I failed utterly as a teacher in educating Postman about the importance of digital media. And the last time I saw Neil before he died, I think he died of lung cancer, he for the first time, had found out that I was a science fiction writer, and we had a great discussion. And he was saying, "I had no idea you wrote science fiction." So, see, he was like you. I said, "Yeah," and that made me very happy that he finally read some of my work. But he was a charming man. He was a gifted teacher. He just happened to be wrong in his analysis of media.
Well, yeah, I was really surprised to see that he had directed your dissertation, because he's not known for being as enthusiastic as you,
Yeah.
to put it mildly. So that's a great story. Yeah, when I found out that you write science fiction, I immediately downloaded and read the Plot to Save Socrates, which I loved. I thought it was great.
Thank you.
I won't give anything away, but it's
Yeah.
there's time travel involved, and it has to do with Socrates, and it's pretty great. So it must be hard to write time travel. I've always thought,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
you must have had timelines written out or something,
Not, yeah. Not right now,
yeah,
but in my head. Well, actually, right
yeah.
now, at this moment, and again, I know it's going to be, a couple of months before this podcast is available, but I'm now about 90% finished writing my third Sierra Waters novel, so it'll no doubt be finished, maybe even published. But I'm not going to tell anybody the name until it's published. But it'll be clear on Amazon that that's the third novel. So I'm right into this, thinking through these timeline issues. And I got to tell you, the third novel goes much further than the first two novels in terms of really twisting around timelines and doing things that are sort of implied were happening in the first and even the second, but didn't actually have done. So it is fabulous. I mean, in one sense, I go swimming just about every day, and I often think about the fact I'm swimming, that thinking about a time travel novel is like the equivalent in the mind. It's like mental exercise.
Oh,
And
sure.
and I actually swim in a pretty slow, leisurely way. I was like a lap pool near where I live, north of New York, and I do the breaststroke, nice and slow, but sometimes like an hour or so. And it not only helps me write, but that's, to me, what thinking through these time travel paradoxes are. You can't do it fast, because if you try to do it too fast, you'll die of exhaustion, because I mean, it is so mind-boggling. But if you just like sort of think it through and weave it through and slow everything down, at least for me, I can see then where all these things are connected. But I just love it. I mean, I think, in fact, and people are sometimes surprised to hear this, I don't think as a technology, time travel will ever happen. I mean, I'd be excited if it did, mainly because I think the paradoxes are just, insurmountable. And the paradox, if I go back in time and accidentally prevent my grandparents from meeting, well, then how did I go back in time in the first place? And you can resolve this by saying, well, the instant that you accidentally or deliberately prevented your grandparents from meeting, by the way, it's usually the older version is you kill your grandfather, but there's no need to be so violent. We can just prevent it from meeting. How then did you go back? Well, the instant that happens, a new reality was created. Call it reality 2, in which you don't exist. But you, the time traveler, went back, are 1, or reality 1. So that's how you can work that. But if you follow that to its logical conclusion, it means at every drop of the time traveler's hat, a new reality is brought into being. That's frankly even more incredible than time travel itself. So yeah, you could figure out ways of getting around it, but I think in reality it probably is not going to happen, and that's another reason why it's so much fun to write about, because it really, it's science fiction at its epitome, because it'll probably never happen, but yet it seems so scientifically logical when you map it out.
Yeah, and that's why it's so fun to read as well, right? Because
Yeah.
thinking through all those problems. I've heard over and over that, like from people who write and do other kinds of intellectual work, that exercise is important. You said you swim for about an hour a day. I know people who walk. I walk. I know people who run. Right. And this is just a really practical question, because you are so prolific. Do you have a set of habits or kind of systems that you work through? Do you just wake up and write, or?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you, I think exercise is important, and in the winter, Fordham University has an indoor pool, but I'm not able to swim as much as in the summer. So I do try then to walk more in the winter, so I still get that exercise, and it does get the juices flowing. But I'll tell you what my secret is as far as being so prolific, and that's not letting any social requirement get in the way of my writing, because there are a myriad, of social things. I mean, you have friends, you have family. They're always for the best reasons, in effect, wanting you to be with them, and it's great. You do want to be with them, and I'm not saying that you should become a hermit, but I found that obviously you might, in a good situation, feel that the book or the work is writing itself, but that's just a metaphor. You're not writing. The book's not writing itself. You're writing. And in order for you to write, you have to write. And that means, I think, that you have to have a frame of mind in which anytime you feel like writing, you need to give in to that impulse, if at all possible. Now, smartphones have made that a lot easier, because I've been known to pull over to the side of the road and quickly, send an email to myself with a couple of lines, if it's that important. Usually it can wait to wherever I'm going to. But obviously I have a computer in my office at Fordham University. I teach a class. Very often I come upstairs to my office, close the door for 15, 20 minutes, and write. Charles Darwin, to just bring another prolific writer into this, a great thinker, was known as a hypochondriac when he was alive. And near the end of his life, he admitted that most of the time when he was telling people he wasn't feeling well, he was lying. He just needed the time to write. So, that's, I think, what it takes. The fact is, in the end, the social engagements that you don't do and the people that you might disappoint by not seeing them, they'll forgive you when you have a book out, because they'll be so happy that you have a book out and that they know an author. But that I think is really the key. But the other point, though, that I would really emphasize is that's what works for me. There are some people who need the regimen of writing at the same time every day. To me, that would be like a straitjacket. So for me, the regimen is, you feel like writing, write. And there's no doubt that as soon as we finish this, I'm going to get back to writing. It's a beautiful day, and I'm sitting out here on my porch, and I'm going to get some more writing done. If somebody calls me and says, "Hey, do you want to have lunch?" I'm definitely going to say no, because right now I want to do writing. Maybe tomorrow, if somebody calls me and I've just finished writing something and I need a break, I'll have lunch with somebody outside of my cottage, but my porch. But that, I think, is the key for me. The larger point is, I think most people know sooner or later, or more or less, what works best for them. And if you want to call it your muse, or as the Greeks thought, amuse me outside, came in and inspired them. Some people think the muse is inside of us. Whatever that is, you need to identify it as best as you can and feed it, give it what it wants. And that way you'll be happier, it will be happier, and if you're a good writer, the world will be happier.
That's great advice. That is great advice. It sounds like you forgive yourself if you don't write for a day because it wasn't there, but you also make sure you do write when the desire or the idea hits, and that's interesting.
That's right.
I'm more regimented myself. I try to be. I try to write every morning just before I do anything else. But the social engagements, that's really interesting, because with social media, going back to kind of this digital media is destroying us thing, the social it's in your home as well now, right? If you leave your browser open, if you have your Facebook or your Twitter open, or your email, and I found like just a simple act of closing my browser increases my creativity and my output, many fold.
Yeah.
And it's the same concept, but it's hard because a lot of people don't want to do that. Put your phone in the other room, close the browser or whatever, and that's been my version of not doing the social stuff.
Right.
But I'm guilty of someone calls me wants to lunch, I'll have lunch, or like overcommitting, stuff like that. But that's great advice, and it sounds like it's it's in line with your other advice too, of just if you want to do something, do it.
Yeah,
But
that's right.
the flip side is that you kind of have a responsibility to yourself to actually do it.
That's right.
Right.
Well, look, the fact is, I don't understand people who don't create. So, I'm very different from anybody who doesn't create. I mean, I know a lot of people who don't create, although my family are all creative in one way or another. So I don't understand them, I admit it. But I think that anybody, who does create, at least for me, there are few things as painful as, okay, I'm driving in a car and I'm on the highway. There's no place that I can stop and write something down. And I've gotten to the point where I've thought through this conversation that my characters were having, and I want to write it down. And, again, I've been known in this highway scenario, and assuming I'm driving, myself, nobody else is really inconvenienced. And even if they were, probably I'd inconvenience them. I've been known to pull into a, rest stop and quickly write what I, want to write. Because it's not that I'm afraid I'm going to forget it. It's, how it is, you sometimes get like the words and you know that they're right. Those are the words, you want those exact words, and you can, commit them to memory, but then it sort of freezes the process, and you don't want that to happen either. So that's why I think, if you are writing or doing anything and you give in to that impulse, it's the best thing to do. You feel happier as a result of it, and everyone around you is happier.
Yeah, that's really great. I know there are times I've woken up from dreams with great ideas, and the times I didn't write them down, I'll remember later.
Right, you don't.
Never, it's always gone.
I
Never
know.
stays. Yeah. So yeah, that's great advice. Well, we're recording this on July 23rd of 2014, and I'll probably release it towards the end of August, beginning of September. And if your book is out, your newest one, I'll definitely put a link to it in the show notes. And I'll link to some of your other work as well, for sure, because I've enjoyed reading it, and I know a lot of other people will as well, for sure.
Thank you.
Tell people where they can find you.
Okay, well, there are a bunch of places. In some ways, Twitter is the easiest. I'm at Paul Lev, Paulev. So follow me, say hello. I'll almost certainly follow you back. My blog, which is called Infinite Regress, it can be reached in a variety of ways, but probably the easiest is paullevinson.net, and there are two L's in there, PAULLEVINSON.net, and on there you'll find what's mostly on the blog, my reviews of major television, but you'll also find links all over the blog to my various books, nonfiction and fiction. Search for me on YouTube. Just search Paul Levinson. I have like over 100 videos, up there. Various interviews that I've done with people ranging from Bill O'Reilly to nice people like you on the other end of the spectrum.
Right.
So yeah, I'm all over the place, and but the main point I want to make is I'm very eager to meet more and more people online. It's a lot of fun, and so I'll always be responsive.
I appreciate that, and yeah, you responded very quickly to my invitation, and I really appreciate that as well. So this is going to be primarily an audio podcast, but do you mind if I post the video when I post the audio as well?
Not at all. I'd be delighted if you posted the video.
Great.
That's why I've been smiling so much.
Is that why? I should have combed my hair or something.
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm a hopeless case as far as hair.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Anytime. Have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the WET Podcast, episode number 2 with Paul Levinson. You can find show notes at ericmarshall.net/wet. You can find me at emarsh on Twitter. And you can find the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and anywhere else you find podcasts. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye.